Religion, in its broad meaning, as both an ideology and practice. We are not shy. We are not sorry about we have offered for our religion, and we have sacrificed, and we are still ready for more sacrifices till the victory of Islam. The real Islamic front and the real Islamic opposition against Zionism. We are here. The real Islamic front against Zionism, communism, and imperialism. La ilaha illallah! La ilaha illallah! La ilaha illallah! La ilaha illallah! And now, as an answer to the second question, why did they bring us here? They bring us here for two reasons. First, in a trial to abort the expanding Islamic movement, which threatens these dishonest Asian Arab regimes. La ilaha illallah! By the stupid agent Anwar Sadat. دم المسلم مش قربان. دم المسلم مش قربان. لليهود والامريكان. لليهود والامريكان. دم المسلم مش قربان. دم المسلم مش قربان. لليهود والامريكان. لليهود والامريكان. القصاص لدم خالد. القصاص لدم خالد. القصاص لدم خالد. القصاص لدم خالد. We have suffered in these past 14 months the severest forms of humiliation and torture in the dirty Egyptian jails, in the horrible prison of al-Gama'a, and the prison of Tura, and the prison of al-Istiqbal, and the prison of al-Marj, where we suffered the severest inhuman treatment. There, they kicked us, they beated us, they whipped us with the electric cables, they shocked us with electricity, and they used the wild dogs, and they hanged us over the edges of the doors with our hands tied at the back. There they arrested the wives, the mothers, the fathers, the sisters, and the sons in a trial to put a psychological press over these innocent prisoners. Khaybar, Khaybar, ya Yahud! Khaybar, Khaybar, ya Yahud!
Not much is known about Sayyid Imam Al Sharif, otherwise known as Dr.Fadl. But what is known is that Sharif was born in 1950 in the southern Egyptian province of Beni Suef, 75 miles south of Cairo. His father was a headmaster in Beni Suef, and Sharif studied the Quran and was a Hafiz, someone who has memorized the Quran, by the time he finished 6th grade. At 15, the Egyptian government enrolled him in a boarding school in Cairo for exceptional students. At the age of 18, he entered medical school and began preparing for a career as a plastic surgeon specializing in burn injuries. He has been described as being pious and high-minded, prideful and rigid, all at the same time. It was while studying medicine at Cairo University in the 1970s that Al Sharif met Ayman al-Zawahiri. Imam learned that Zawahiri belonged to a subterranean world. He later told a reporter from Al-Hayat, which is a pan-Arabic newspaper, "I knew from another student that Ayman was part of an Islamic group. The group came to be called Al-Jihad, which later became Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Its discussion centered on the idea that real Islam no longer existed because Egypt's rulers had turned away from Islamic law or Sharia and were steering believers away from salvation and towards secular modernity. The young members of Al-Jihad decided that they had to act. In doing so, these men were placing their lives and perhaps their families in terrible jeopardy. Egypt's military government, then led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, had a vast network of informers and secret police. The prisons, especially Torah prison, were brimming with Islamist detainees locked away in dungeons where torture was routine. Despite this repressive atmosphere, an increasing number of Egyptians, disillusioned with Nasser's socialist secular government, were turning to the mosque for political answers. In 1967, Nasser led Egypt and its Arab allies into a disastrous confrontation with Israel, which crushed the Egyptian Air Force in an afternoon. The Sinai Peninsula soon passed to Israeli control, and the Arab world was traumatized. And that deepened the appeal of radical Islamists who argued that Muslims had fallen out of God's favor, and that only by returning to the religion as it was originally practiced could Islam regain its supremacy in the world. In 1977, Zawahiri asked Imam to join his group, presenting himself as a mere delegate of the organization. Imam told Al-Hayat that this agreement was conditional upon meeting the Islamic scholars who Zawahiri insisted were in the group. Clerical authority was essential to validate the drastic deeds these men were contemplating. However, the meeting never happened. According to Imam, Ayman was a charlatan who used secrecy as a pretext. I discovered that Ayman himself was the emir of this group and that it didn't have any sheikhs. Following the 1981 assassination of the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, who had signed the peace treaty with Israel just 2 years earlier, thousands of Egyptian Islamists were rounded up. These included Zawahiri, who was charged with smuggling weapons, but not Al Sharif, who had fled the country. He was tried in absentia and convicted. Al Sharif had left Israel for the United Arab Emirates in 1982, where he worked as a doctor. He then resided in Pakistan for a few weeks before leaving for Saudi Arabia, and then went back to Pakistan again, where he worked for a Kuwaiti Red Crescent hospital in Peshawar. In Pakistan, Sharif worked with Ayman Zawahiri to rebuild Egyptian Islamic Jihad in exile. And in the mid-1980s, Sharif is thought to have become Egyptian Islamic Jihad's emir or chief. Al-Sharif had denied this, saying that his role was merely one of offering Sharia guidance. Zawahiri, whose reputation had been stained by his prison confessions, handled tactical operations. Al-Sharif impressed other jihadis with his encyclopedic knowledge of the Quran and the Hadith. According to one source, Al-Sharif stayed in the background. Ayman was the one in front, but the real leader was Al-Sharif, aka Dr.Fadl. During the next 3 years, these two men, who had once been so profoundly alike, began to diverge. Zawahiri, who had given up the name of other Al-Jihad members as well, was humiliated by this betrayal. Prison had hardened him. Torture sharpened his appetite for revenge. And he abandoned the ideological purity of his youth. Imam, by contrast, had not been forced to face the limits of his belief. He had slipped out of Egypt and made his way to Peshawar, along with working next to Zawahiri. In Peshawar, Imam Sharif wrote a text for jihadis to school them in the proper way to fight battles, and preached that the real objective was not victory over the Soviets, but martyrdom and eternal salvation. This work, called The Essential Guide for Preparation, appeared in 1988 and became one of the most important texts in the jihadis' training. He wrote, "The guide begins with the premise that jihad is the natural state of Islam. Muslims must always be in conflict with non-believers. Fadl also asserts resorting to peace only in moments of abject weakness, because jihad is, above all, a religious exercise. There are divine rewards to be gained. He who gives money for jihad will be compensated in heaven, but not as much as the person who acts. The greatest prize goes to the martyr. Every able-bodied believer is obligated to engage in jihad, since most Muslim countries are ruled by infidels, who must be forcibly removed in order to bring about an Islamic state. The way to bring an end to the rule's unbelief is armed rebellion. Some Arab governments regarded the book so dangerous that anyone caught with a copy was subject to arrest. In 1989, Osama bin Laden had moved from Afghanistan to the Sudan along with the Zawahiri and most members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Imam Al Sharif, who was finishing what he considered his masterwork, the compendium of the pursuit of divine knowledge, agreed to go at the urging of Al-Zawahiri. On September 10, 1993, Al Sharif took his wife and family to Sudan, where he was received on arrival by Ayman al-Zawahiri in Khartoum airport. The relations between the two men, however, deteriorated further during Al Sharif's time in the Sudan. Sometime in the early 1990s, al-Zawahiri and Al Sharif fell out over questions of strategy and tactics. Al Sharif opposed Islamic Jihad's joining other Islamist groups, al-Gama'a al-Islamiyya, in its terror campaign against the Egyptian government and foreign tourists in Egypt, saying, "This is senseless activity that will bring no benefit." Al Sharif believed that violent attacks were futile and instead advocated slow and steady infiltration into the structure of the state, but the group as a whole decided otherwise. After two unsuccessful bombing attempts, members of al-Jihad demanded that their leader resign. Many were surprised to discover that the emir was Dr.Fadl, Imam Al Sharif, who was willing to give up the post. And Zawahiri became the official leader as well as leader of all tactical operations. Before he left the Sudan, however, Al Sharif gave a copy of his finished manuscript to Zawahiri, saying it could be used to raise money. Al Sharif's second book was more than 1,000 pages long, and its author used the pseudonym Abdul Qadir bin Abdul Aziz. It opens with the assertion that a man may enter the faith in many ways, yet be expelled from it by just one deed. Despite Al Sharif's complaints that the al-Islamiyya bombing campaign, his book defined Islam narrowly and takfir very broadly. Among those who were not only sinners, but apostates of Islam and deserving of death, according to Dr.Fadl, are the rulers of Egypt and the Arab countries, those who obey them and those who participate in elections. The infidels rule, his prayers, and the prayers of those who pray behind them are invalid, Dr. Fadl decrees. His blood may be shed legally by true Muslims. I say to Muslims in all candor that secular nationalist democracy opposes your religion and your doctrine, and in submitting to it, you leave God's book behind. Other Muslims who are actively infidels include anyone employed by the government, the police, and the courts, and anyone who works for peaceful change instead of violent jihad. In addition, those who disagree with these ideas are also heretics and deserve to be killed. According to Fadl, Zawahiri was delighted with the result, saying, "This book is a victory from Almighty God." But Zawahiri also edited the book before publishing it, removing a barbed critique of the jihad movement and specific organizations and individuals, including al-Gama'a al-Islamiyya, with whom Zawahiri was attempting to engineer a merger and changing the title to Guide to the Path of Righteousness for Jihad and Belief. Al Sharif became furious with Zawahiri when he found out, refusing to accept his apology and telling Al-Hayat, "I do not know anyone in the history of Islam prior to Ayman al-Zawahiri who engaged in such lying, cheating, forgery, and betrayal of trust by transgressing against someone else's book." Al Sharif reportedly severed his ties with al-Jihad and devoted his time to the medical work and theological studies. He took his family to Sana'a, Yemen, following the 1994 Yemeni civil war, then to the mountain town of Ibib, and began working in a local hospital. His son, Ismail, insisted his father had by then severed all ties and links with militant groups. He now called himself Dr. Abdul Aziz al-Sharif. Many years later, in the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks on the United States, al-Sharif was questioned by Yemen's political security organization, the Yemeni Secret Police, while at work as a surgeon at the Al-Shifa Hospital in Ibib Governorate, south of Sana'a, on October 28, 2001. Shortly after he turned himself in, he was held for 3 years in detention in Sana'a, without charge, without trial, and without access to an attorney. On February 28, 2004, al-Sharif was transferred to Egypt. He was eventually transferred to Scorpion Prison, a facility inside Tora Prison, where major political figures were held. There, Dr. Fadl was serving a life sentence. Although, according to his son, his cell was a private room with a bath and a small kitchen, refrigerator, and a television. During his imprisonment in Egypt, he wrote, Wadiyat Tarshid al-Amma al-Jihadi fi Mis al-Alam, document of right guidance for jihad activity in Egypt and the world. Also translated as Rationalizing Jihad in Egypt and the World. In it, he proclaimed, we are prohibited from committing aggression, even if the enemies of Islam do just that. In November of 2007, his book, The Initiative, was attacking Al-Qaeda and calling for a stop to jihad activities both in the West and in Muslim countries, was published in serial form in two Arab dailies, the Kuwaiti Al-Jarida and the Egyptian Al-Masir Al-Yawm. Al-Sharif claims that hundreds of Egyptian jihadists from various factions, including a majority of Islamic Jihad members, had endorsed his position. Later, author Lawrence Wright had described it as undermining the entire intellectual framework of jihadist warfare. Al-Sharif narrowed down those who may be targets of jihad. Unjust Muslim rulers are excluded. And Dr. Fadl quotes the Prophet Muhammad advising Muslims, those who rebel against the Sultan shall die a pagan death. Non-Muslims are not an acceptable target unless they are actively attacking Muslims. There is nothing in the Sharia about killing Jews and the Nazarenes, the Christians, referred to by some as the Crusaders. They are the neighbors of the Muslims, and bring kind to one's neighbors is a religious duty. Foreigners in Muslim countries may actually be Muslims, or they may be invited into the country for work, which is a kind of a treaty and exempts them from being targets of jihad. To Muslims living in non-Islamic countries eager to wage jihad, Dr. Fadl writes, I say it is not honorable to reside with people, even if they were non-believers and not part of a treaty. If they gave you permission to enter their homes and live with them, and even if they gave you security for yourself and your money, and if they gave you the opportunity to work or study, or they granted you political asylum with a decent life and the other acts of kindness, and then betray them through killing and destruction, this was not in the manners and practices of the Prophet. Dr. Fadl also spoke to current jihadis. While terrorizing the enemy is a legitimate duty, al-Sharif believes that legitimate terror must follow Islamic law. As for the current or recent jihad, the jihad in Afghanistan will lead to the creation of an Islamic state with the triumph of the Taliban if God wills. He spoke about Palestine, saying, if I were not for the jihad in Palestine, the Jews would have crept toward the neighboring countries a long time ago. And without jihad in Iraq, America would have moved into Syria. However, the strife between the Sunnis and Shiites in the jihad in Iraq is troubling because harming those who are affiliated with Islam but have a different creed is forbidden. Examples of unlawful slaughter include Al-Qaeda's terrorist attacks in America, London, and Madrid, which were wrong because they were based on nationality, which is forbidden under Islam. Al-Sharif critiqued the hijackers of 9/11 on the grounds that they betrayed the enemy because the visas to the United States they received were a kind of contract of protection. He would later write, "The followers of bin Laden entered the United States with this knowledge and on his orders double-crossed its population, killing and destroying the prophets God's prayer and peace be upon him said, on the day of judgment, every double-crosser will have a banner up proportionate to his treachery." He also criticized the attack for the retaliation it brought forth. People hate America, and the Islamist movements feel their hatred and their impotence. Ramming America has become the shortest road to fame and leadership among the Arabs and Muslims. But what good is it to destroy one of your enemy's buildings and he destroys one of your countries? What good is it if you kill one of his people and he kills 1,000 of yours? That, in short, is my evaluation of 9/11. In what is thought to have been an effort to dispel suspicions that the book did not represent al-Sharif's true feelings, Mohammed Salah, the Cairo bureau chief of Al-Hayat, was allowed into Torah prison to interview Dr. Fadl. The result was published in a 6-part series where Dr. Fadl defended his work as his own and left no doubt of his personal grudge toward Zawahiri. In the interview, Dr. Fadl labels 9/11 a catastrophe for Muslims because Al-Qaeda's actions caused the death of tens of thousands of Muslims, Arabs, Afghans, Pakistanis, and others. Zawahiri denies Muslims living in non-Muslim countries are treated fairly, pointing out that in France, Muslim girls are forbidden to wear hijab to school, that Muslim men are prevented from marrying more than one wife, and from beating their wives as allowed by the Sharia. Dr. Fadl claims that this is not entirely accurate. Muslims in host countries should not be expected to have Islamic religion adhering to people who do not practice the faith. The jubilation felt by some Egyptians after 9/11 was tied in part to a hope that their lives would finally change, no doubt for the better. They expected that America, having been bloodied, would loosen its grip on the Muslim world. Without American support, the tyrants of the Middle East would be pushed aside by the Islamists who posed the only potent alternative. But the United States, instead of withdrawing, invaded 2 Muslim countries and became even more immersed in the politics of the region. Nevertheless, the audacity of Al-Qaeda's attacks helped give radical Islamists credibility among people who were desperate for change. The years immediately after 9/11 presented an opportunity for the Islamists to offer their vision of a redeemed political system that brought about real improvements in people's lives. Instead, they continued to propagate their fantasies of theocracy and a caliphate, which had little change of ever happening and did nothing to address the actual problems facing the Egyptians: illiteracy, joblessness, and the desperation that came from watching the rest of the world pass them by. As a result, the young were eager for fresh thinking, a way to escape the dead end of radical Islam. Despite subjective objections, the imprisoned members of the Islamic group largely accepted the leader's new position. Dr. Fadl would later say that he was initially skeptical of the prisoners' apparent repentance, which looked like a ploy for better treatment. However, several of the participants in the discussions had already been sentenced to death and were wearing the red clothing that identified the prisoner as a condemned man. The hatred for Hosni Mubarak, the leader and president of Egypt, did not end with Dr. Fadl leaving the Islamic group. It began many years ago under the leadership of people such as Sayyid Qutb, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Muhammad ibn al-Salam al-Faraj, Qasim al-Qamari, Isam al-Qamari, Isam Islambuli, Khalid Islambuli, and Sayyid Imam Al Sharif, who was the only one to find his humanity and leave the perverted faith of the Wahhabi behind and find the nature of God within himself and within his faith.